Hi, my name is Sloan Coachman. I'm an art history student here at UC Santa Barbara. Today I'm going to be interviewing Fran Siegel, the current artist in residence at the Art, Design, and Architecture Museum here on campus. We're going to be discussing her current exhibition, Translocation and Overlay. So to begin, I'd really like it if you could give me some background information about yourself as an artist.
I currently live and work in Los Angeles, and I moved to LA in 2002. I went to Tyler School of Art as an undergrad in drawing and painting, and then I did my MFA at Yale and moved to New York shortly after that, and I lived there for 15 years.
Is there a reason that you made the move from New York to Los Angeles?
One reason was that I have a tenured teaching job at Cal State Long Beach, so I moved here for that. But I also, as a result of 9/11, there was a artist residency program in Santa Fe, and I went there because I had a studio in Lower Manhattan. And I was really fascinated and interested in how light over a much more expansive space really affected my work. And when I was in New York, I was working with light and perception, but it was really very much about a kind of narrow space between buildings and also light that reflected off of buildings, mirror images of things. So I really felt like the distance was really started to become really important in my work, and I felt like it was terrific to be able to have the chance to move out to the West Coast and to be in a different environment spatially. And the other thing is I think for artists in New York, it's always a real estate problem, and you're always either downsizing and making smaller work, and I actually really wanted to work on larger projects and be much more ambitious with my work, so the move was extremely positive.
Do you think being a teacher has affected your art making process? Has it taught you new things, or have your students inspired you in any way?
They do. I mean, I think part of my teaching is always about the process of making work and expanding ideas. So it's also that my work has influenced my teaching, but I think that it's really important, or for me it's really important to work with students. There's a kind of wonderful exchange, and I feel like, especially the students that I have, you know, they're mostly from middle class, lower middle class families, and I think in terms of the art world, it's sort of amazing to be able to play a role in trying to level the playing field, that it's not just out of extreme privilege, and I think the art world is sort of filled with that, so I really enjoy teaching for that reason, and I like working with fresh minds, and the other things I really like reading a lot in terms of art criticism, and it gives me a chance to, or maybe a reason to really delve into things, and I have a ready-made reading group, which is my class, so yeah.
You mentioned that you were stationed in Los Angeles. How did you develop this project around Santa Barbara?
Well, it began when Elyse Gonzales, the curator here, invited me to do the project. And it really, when she invited me to do the project, it was, the idea really was that it would be about this particular location. But I think that the reason why I was an appropriate artist for this is because my work has really become even more increasingly about place and location and examining places from various different points of view and perspectives. So I've been working with the subject of LA from aerial imagery that I take, and it initially was a way for me to understand the structure or lack of structure in a city that is surrounded by a landscape that sort of hems it in. And I really, also because LA is not a design city, but it has all these different segments, it became really important, or maybe the only way that I could really understand it was from the air. So I've been making these, since 2007, I've been making these really complicated collage drawings that are really monumental and sort of room or wall size. And Elyse had seen one of them, and I think understood that I was interested, or I might be interested in working on a subject that was local. And I think the other thing is I think that the idea of local really interests me from a local perspective. So I think that it's, the ultimate question for me is like, can you examine something that is local and immediate and make it have resonance for a larger global context? So what kinds of questions would the artist, would I have to ask that would be further reaching, you know?
Do you feel like through these projects that you're making a statement about urbanization in the history of this city building and whatnot?
Yeah, and I would say that urbanization, modern urbanization is different than historic, because if you think about cities, European cities that are cluster cities, they're really designed. Like you can look at Rome and the idea of the wheel and the spokes in the wheel the pattern of that follow throughout the city. Whereas I think that what happens in cities of today is that they're not designed because it's always a commercial issue that sort of takes hold. And I think Santa Barbara is interesting because it's a kind of hybrid of both of those things. Like on one hand, I think the city fancies itself as a European city, and in fact the model, the grid, if you will, is based on a kind of colonialist perspective. But however, there's again the landscape, which I feel is always sort of battling with the forces. So even though the city itself might imagine itself as a clustered, enclave that's self-enclosed and utopian, there's all these forces at play. And I think that's actually what really interested me in the project as a whole.
And then I know these images you designed them in a way that they could be taken off the wall and rearranged in a different sequence, that there was this kind of undesigned element to it. Does that speak to this idea of the city being undesigned in a way?
That actually was a much more practical thing for me. When I started to develop the project, I realized that, I knew that it was going to take over the whole space. But I actually wanted it to evolve, and so I didn't want to, let's say, design it as a whole drawing from the beginning. I wanted to see what, because I didn't know that much, I kind of wanted to see where it could go. And so I decided to work in segments because it allowed me the freedom to change my mind and to actually make, let's say, a hypothesis about the project, not at the beginning, but towards the end. And then, actually, I did like the idea, and I've always actually liked the idea of portable work, that something that, it's a sort of fluxus idea, that something that is very little can expand like a kid and take over, has a larger installation power.
And then with these drawings that are kind of hypothetical or based off, or more abstract compared to the data, how did you choose to include ceramic pieces in the exhibition?
Well, it's interesting. The ceramic pieces are more like artifacts, and there were also some things that I couldn't quite express in the drawings. I've been working with porcelain maybe for the last 3, 4, 5 years, and And actually part of it is that there's an amazing ceramics program and facilities at Cal State Long Beach. And so it was really inspiring to be able to work there. And porcelain for me is actually a lot like a white wall. It feels like a material that is very light-based, and the porcelain that I work with, like you can basically see right through it. So I felt like if I could work with an object or pieces also that could be like artifacts, that would be really interesting. The other thing actually that initiated the porcelain originally was that I wanted to create a key for all of the drawings, and I thought that if I created a kind of three-dimensional map, that if I created 50 pieces, they could all have an insignia on them that was a key for the drawing. But actually, as I did that, I realized that it actually made things maybe more complicated and confusing. So we ended up working with an actual written key. But however, the porcelain pieces that I did make, there's two sets of them, and one is the set of the map, which is a contour map of Mountain View. And Mountain View is a place, as you know, that has a history of experimentation in the 60s, and it's the highest land mound within the city itself. And I was interested in making that as a physical contour map, partially because there are contour maps from Los Angeles to Santa Barbara that actually are the underlay of this whole project. And then the second piece that's porcelain particles are the segments that I found at the butterfly preserve that were leaves and things, and I actually made them. I took photographs there, which became a blueprint underlay, and the pieces are porcelain findings of those leaves and other things. And I like this idea of recreating.
And so I know for the written key that you didn't want the facts to be so connected to the drawings that it told the viewer everything. How did you kind of come to that idea that you didn't want them to be directly related?
Well, what I didn't want was for the viewer to line up, let's say, a drawing or an image of a drawing and say, oh, that's where it is. Like, I didn't want that kind of identification. I wanted a little bit more of a search, and to also look at the drawings first as drawings rather than identification of something. However, what I really became interested in is this idea of how things pass through the landscape, and for also what duration they exist. So I love the idea of a timeline that began with the Chumash and settlements along the coast, and actually continued through recent fires and so on. And so that was arranged in a linear way. However, the drawings are not arranged in that same pattern. And again, that's so that somebody might be able to look at the key and see what types of subjects I was working with. And then if they spent the time, they could identify what was what, but they could still see the drawings first as drawings.
And then I know one of the major themes that you played with was this idea of the circus, the traveling circus. How prevalent is that in the finished product?
Well, the circus itself was actually part of a larger idea, which is really the idea of transience and how things move through a landscape. And again, Santa Barbara sees itself as a sort of utopian city, and that means it's like that's really where the grid is. But however, things like earthquakes and water systems and population movement and all kinds of things and butterfly migrations all move through the place, and so I was really interested in really that idea. And I did, in searching for subjects that were about migration, I found out that in the turn of the century, there were these circus acts that came to Santa Barbara. And the circus to me also represented a kind of fringe element. And again, I was sort of working with these ideas of fringe or transience, and so it became a perfect subject. But also, the circus moves through a lot of the drawings. So sometimes the circus are little pieces that are cut out, and they're kind of literally traveling through the show. The other thing is about a circus is they're like high wire acts, and to me that's the most flimsy form of architecture there is. It's just a string, and a ladder. And so I like this idea of something barely being there as an architecture, like something passing through and not quite existing and vanishing and moving on to another town.
How did you come up with the title Translocation and Overlay?
It took a long time, actually, and many different lists and walks where I was sounding out these titles. I liked the idea of two things. First of all, that sort of were not quite the same or symmetrical with each other. Overlays is kind of easy. It's the overlay that a lot of the pieces are transparent or translucent, and so this idea of overlaying information, which is literally what happens here, but that kind of overlaying is what it's a kind of scientific or math-like thing that you do, is a finding, an overlay. Translocation was also about this idea of passing through, and it's not really a word, so I like the idea of piecing those two things together. Going across a location instead of staying there.
A lot of the formal elements that you include is like cross-hatching. Is there a reason that you use cross-hatching compared to just like normal shading?
Normal shading. So cross-hatching interests me for a few reasons. One is that I've always been really fascinated with Morandi and his prints, and the idea that in cross-hatching you can build up a value. So if you start with an X or you start with a line, and that's like the paper is value number one, and actually with me, value number one is the cutout. Value number two might be the paper, and value number three might be one line, and then value number four might be more than one line. So you kind of build up the drawing in phases, and I like that idea of really working with density and building density, because that's also the material itself. But I also am referring to the digital as well. So I see the project as a kind of, all of these drawings were derived from data, from sources, and the crosshatch is a kind of handmade version of interpretation of that. So, yeah.
And then I also had a question about the use of a limited color palette when working on this. Since the paper is just kind of sheer, that you chose to stick with something that was more monotone or monochromatic or limited in the color choices.
I've always been, I would say, a structuralist in terms of color. So I've never been interested in using color for color's sake. So actually, in a lot of cases, blue is used because it's a kind of reference to a blueprint. And there's also a lot of earth tones that are used, but nothing is really used as, just an expression of color.
And then I know that you broke these sections kind of into earth, wind, fire. Would you say that the use of colors in those groupings match? Like with water, you would use more blue, and with fire, you use more reds and orange or earthy tones like that. Would you say that continued through, or is that something that didn't really?
A little bit, but I'm probably extremely unpredictable as things go. So that sounds nice, but it didn't really work that way. And actually, certain things are color keyed, like there's the geological map, and I needed to switch colors within there so that each of the rocks could be articulated separately. So I was conscious of that, but again, it didn't go that far out of range. Yeah, I used gold a lot symbolically, or for its reflective quality. As I mentioned, I used blue as a blueprint. I used pencil a lot, and then a lot of earth tones. Yeah.
So do you think you could expand on this idea of transience and how it relates to Santa Barbara?
Well, the project itself, again, I was really interested in this idea of contrast. So Santa Barbara is a planned place, but then there's all these forces moving through it. So I worked with wind patterns, I worked with population movements, so I used data and mapping of people and where they are located. Erosion, how in different years, how erosion hits the coast, cloud movement over the landscape. I also flew in a small plane from Los Angeles to Santa Barbara and took photographs of that trip. So really the sort of heart of the project is about this idea of, on one hand, we've got the city, which again fancies itself as a utopia, but then there's all this idea of movement and mobility around it. And that's really what I chose to focus on. So again, ideas about erosion, also systems. The thing is that in a city there's always designed infrastructure. But how does that infrastructure really hold back nature? There's a drawing about the vineyards and how they're organized. So there's a kind of question of geometry versus nature.
And then I know like you said, you use these images of data, but you also use historical elements. How did those historical elements interact with the images that are more based on data?
Well, I think that was also about keeping the project really open. So by overlaying these pieces, they automatically do relate. And actually, the thing that I would say that's really important about the project is the idea of building a place. Like, I think that the present tense of a place exists because of its history. So as an artist, if one were to examine all of the factors that exist in the landscape and in the surroundings and again in the mobility, you could really reconstruct and deconstruct a place at the same time. And so by dealing with all of this data, the thought is that you could get a portrait of the place. At the same time, I would learn something about it. Yeah.
Do you think that working with all this data and doing this research and then actually completing this project has changed your perspective of Santa Barbara, or made it grow, or confirmed whatever you thought before?
Well, I don't get lost here anymore. It's actually made me want to study other places. So I could see this model expanding in other ways, and I think that maybe the ultimate question is like whether if I did a portrait, let's say, of another place, would it be entirely different, and maybe would it have a completely different format because the archive or the information was incredibly different. And again, I think, one of the things that's really interesting about here, it's almost like a socio-political experiment, and that has had so many different rises and falls of those things. So, like the 60s were really different here. I think that Santa Barbara is almost probably like the ultimate in city planning. And then that might seem perhaps confining, So I think that those things crop up in all the drawings. In a sense, one could actually look at the project in a semi-political way, but it's maybe not that obvious. And it wasn't initially my intention, but again, I think that when when you examine the place, and you truly do, you don't necessarily know what you're going to find. I think that one of maybe the most political types of drawings or charged drawings in the series is the fires, because they're derived from images of burned sticks that I made a pattern out of, and then I looked at the area, the surface area, and then I found the name of the fire, but I actually searched for logos that exist. So like the gap fire, the subtraction of the word gap is the chain store. And so again, there's that kind of odd play between something being corporate or over-designed and something being wild and rampant. So.
And then does that kind of relate back to the idea that you said, like, LA has really been a city formed on this idea of commercialism, and so you're including these brand names that, represent commercialism? Do you think that had a play?
Well, that kind of commercialism exists in Santa Barbara too. But I think that's actually another interesting point or question that you asked, because I think that Santa Barbara could actually not exist in its current state without LA, which it despises. So part of the other thing is that the backbone of the whole project is the trip from Los Angeles to Santa Barbara, because I see these two cities as connected and in a way kind of codependent. The fact that Santa Barbara, a lot of people here, might be here because they made their money in Los Angeles, and now they're coming up here. So the economy of the city is actually being driven by another city, which is like its, sort of dirty secret. So I see that the undesigned aspect of Los Angeles and the designed aspect of Santa Barbara are actually sort of pairs in a way. So that's why I chose to include that connection, and also because I was traveling back and forth from them.
Is there anything with this project that you wish you may have had more time to include, or wish you had maybe more resources to include that you weren't able to include in this project?
I could see actually doing 50 more drawings. I really could, and I could keep going, really. The very last drawing that I did was one of the earlier things in time period of the earthquake fire, like the sort of thing that made the redesign happen. The Spanish Mission streets. So, yeah.
Is there one image that you would say is your favorite that you maybe not necessarily aesthetically your favorite, but maybe the information behind it or the research that goes behind it?
Actually, the funny thing is that it's maybe the most questionable historically. So this past summer I did a residency in Mallorca, and I found out that there's such an incredible connection between the city of Petra on Mallorca and Santa Barbara. But the Historical Society here actually sort of disputes this idea. So in a way, it doesn't matter, because I kind of made this either fact or fiction about that connection. And it was really about, that the Spanish missions that were set up in California came from the priests that arrived from Mallorca. And then the design of the central squares are actually, they mimic what this town of Petra looks like. So there's a drawing that actually is of Petra, but it has an image of Santa Barbara in it, which is what it was there. There was a place in Petra that had a picture of the Santa Barbara mission. And I like that kind of cross connection. That actually brings up another point, which is this idea of invisible cities, and also Borges and so Calvino, invisible cities, and the idea of being able to construct a fiction or a fact out of information, and that's essentially like the crux of the project.
Is there anything else that you would like to talk about that we haven't covered?
Maybe just one thing, which is about that sometimes the drawings have more than one subject to them, so the subtraction of the image can be an unrelated subject or a subject that happened in a different time period. So one example of that is the oiled rigs, and then there's a shape that's cut out of it, which is the spill of '69. So that image is sort of multiple. Or the oldest wall in Santa Barbara, which is over there, and that the aqueduct is the image that's cut out of it. So often those two things sort of play with each other.
So a lot of times, even though there's only 50 images, there's a lot more that goes into each image that could make it be multiple images.
Exactly.
Can you tell me about some of your upcoming projects or projects that you're currently working on?
I am just completing now a 35-foot long piece that it's a permanent commission installation that is going, it's for U.S. Arts and Embassy, and it's going to be installed in a consulate in Guayaquil, Ecuador. And I think that I will be installing that within the month. I have to go down there with a crew and hang this piece, which is really complicated. And that piece actually was derived from the form of a ceiba tree, which is from that area. So it's another example of something that was derived from a place and then sort of reformed in my mind and then kind of put back in that place. I just completed a solo exhibition in New York, and actually that was inspired by a lot of the traveling circus imagery that came from here. I expanded on that. And then I'm just in the very, very early stages of developing something with the Fowler Museum at UCLA. So.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure.